I've been hunting for 5 years. Before that, I was in the Army for 10, and before that, I was a scout on the Biathlon team and interrecreational hiking and camping. Sup, is it to say. I've spent a lot of years off the beaten track. I'm in the low-risk category to get into trouble in the woods. I'm armed. I have bear spray. I have with me a radio and or a mobile phone, depending on proximity to cell towers and possibly a GPS, and I always have a compass and maps. I know the woods and how to survive, and I don't spook easily. I typically hunt solo in massive tracts of crown land in northern Ontario. I've seen or heard wolves, coyotes, and mountain lions. I even saw Wolverine once. Black bears do not concern me. Moose are dangerous, but I keep my distance or shoot them, as I'm typically hunting them. Unless I'm badly hurt, I really have nothing to fear from animals in the woods. Humans are the apex predator, after all, and it's good to be king. That being said, I am wary but not afraid of other men I run into in the woods, and most of the time they're friendly and go on their way. Some are aggressive or drunk, but offering them cigarette and kind words tends to calm those guys down. I'll share a couple of unexplained occurrences, however. That still chill me to this day. The first one happened a few years ago while I was solo hunting deer in the fall. I was camped for the night in a vast frozen swampy area. The only access was a decades-old logging track off the main road, and I was several kilometers from that track. There were no other hiking trails or other access, so I was sure I was quite alone. As a matter of fact, I hadn't seen or heard anyone else for 2 days. I had a good dinner and went to sleep as it started to lightly snow. I woke up with a start at 4:32 in the morning. I know the exact time because I looked at my watch. I could clearly hear sleigh bells, the kind Santa's reindeer wear, and there were no other sounds except the wind and snow. No pre-dawn birds' footfalls or snapping twigs, just eerie bells intermittently jingling. At first I thought I was still dreaming, but I forced myself to check all my gear to prove to myself that I was awake. Then I sat there, shivering my tent, praying that whatever was making that sound would go away. Going outside there to look wouldn't have helped. It was pitch black anyway. My mind was running through all the logical possibilities. I'm dreaming. It's a dog or a cat wearing a bell on its collar. It's an escaped reindeer. It's actually Santa. It's hikers wearing bells. My mind started to get away from me. I finally couldn't take it any longer, and I shouted out, "Whoever's ringing those damn bells can go away now." The bells abruptly stopped. I sat there, listening for another couple of hours, my mind racing with chills arching down my spine. Thankfully, the bells never came back. When dawn broke, I scouted the area with my self-loading rifle, looking for a sign of who or what had passed. In the dark, there was a fresh layer of snow on everything, so finding tracks would be easy. Not one track. Nothing for hundreds of paces in every direction. I had been thorough. On discovering that I broke camp and got the fuck out of there, hunting was over for the season in that spot. Sure, I tried to laugh it off, scared out of the woods by Santa. "You're such a little bitch," I said to myself. But I was truly spooked. A few years later, I was out for grouse, beating the bushes for those elusive gray birds. The area I was in was remote but was cut into by some high-voltage power lines and towers. I was walking the edge of one of those cuts, enjoying the sunny day and whistling. I really enjoy upland bird hunting. It's a relaxing way to spend the day and very casual as far as hunting goes. I wasn't surprised to hear ATV engines after some time, and I walked over to the one that stopped near me. "Seen any birds?" He practically yelled at me, still deafened by his engine. I offered my hand, and he shook it. "Hanson," he introduced, looking me up and down. "That's my surname." I chuckled and told him mine. He was an old dude. I'm middle-aged and getting on there, but he was old. We had a smoke and shot the breeze. His great-grandfather had established the first hunting camp in the area back in 1839, and they still ran it every fall. He knew those woods well. We compared shotguns, talked about the beautiful weather and the usual bullshittery. When I found out they had no younger guys in their party, I was actually hoping for an invite to his camp for deer season, was angling the conversation that way. Get some tips and stories, new blood, carrying on the tradition and all. How long you've been coming here? He had cut me off suddenly and sternly. A couple of years. I said, mostly for birds. Then you've heard her. Her? What the fuck was he talking about? The witch? I couldn't help but smile at that, although his face was deadpan and serious. Right away, I knew he was trying to spook me off his hunting spot with the ghost stories. And just before a deer season, to boop, fuck this old codger. What a dick. This is public property after all, so you're telling me a witch has haunted these woods since the 19th century. I was humoring him. Yeah, something like that. He spit and put his smoke out with his boot. Used to live in that abandoned farmhouse off the access road. I had seen the place before a creepy pioneer log cabin, disused for generations. When my young son had been with me one day, he had refused to go near the place. He had complained that it made him feel all wrong. You know, she's nearby when you hear the sleigh bells. My blood froze. Well, nice meeting you, handsome. Thanks for the chat. I stammered and abruptly turned and walked back to the cut, and I could feel him staring at me the whole way. He eventually started his engine and rode away. What an asshole. How did he know that? Was this some sort of backwards folklore about witches and sleigh bells? I walked straight to my truck and drove out of there fast. When I got home, I Googled it for hours and nothing came up. I eventually wrote it off as a coincidence and tried to push it out of my mind. Sometime later, I was packing for my deer hunt. I had buddies coming in from distant cities. It was going to be glorious, and I wouldn't have to go out alone. But then, they all canceled, one by one. Wives in the hospital was one story more, like she's got your balls. Another one had to work the always busy and hectic doctor. That story was more believable. Another one was suddenly working nights. No matter, I was going anyway, and would send them pictures of my magnificent deer and regale them with stories for years, whilst reminding them of their lane cancellations. I went back to the power lines area, as I had seen, and followed many game trails during my bird hunting there. Besides, I sure as shit was not going back to the frozen swamp of witch bells, as I now called it. I knew Hansen and his mates would be around, but I knew where their camp was, and I was heading to the southeast, near Little Birch Lake, deep in the woods. I had butterflies in my stomach, pretty common for me at the beginning of a season, all giddy with excitement, but they were more intense somehow. I tried not to think of Hansen's story. Then again, if Hansen had obviously survived years of hunting in the same woods, so would I. Fuck it. I went. Furthermore, the weather was nice, intermittent sun, and hovering around freezing. Overall, a nice day to go out into the woods. I wore a smile when I headed out. Now, if you've never been big game hunting in close country, in the bush, as it's known, it's rather slow going. You're wearing light boots and sneaking around trying to make as little noise as possible. My buddy and I, we call it Last of the Mohican style. Every step is measured and placed carefully, toe to heel, to reduce noise. Your head's up scanning around, ears straining for any hint of game sounds. You stop, just to listen frequently. The English call it still hunting or stalking. I much prefer it to sitting in a stand freezing your ass off all day. I proceeded southwest from the cut at my snail's pace. It probably took me all day to cover the 5 or 6 kilometers to the lake, but it was exhilarating, gliding silently through the bush like an expert tracker, taking in all the sights, sounds, and smells. The weather had soured over the course of the afternoon, clouding over and getting breezy. It was getting darker and colder. The late fall forest had come alive, swaying and creaking in the breeze. The change had been so gradual I hadn't even noticed it. The witch, it came unbidden into my mind. Fuck you, Hansen, I muttered aloud. You're not going to spook me. I realized at that point that I hadn't had a smoke all day. I lit one and sat down trying to calm my nerves. It was helping. When I was putting it out, I saw something, hint of black, an unusual color, in the woods. There, I shouldered my rifle and clipped the safety off, peering through the illuminated reflex sight. Just me bear. Go. Away now. You don't want to tangle with me. I started talking out loud in the manner I had learned to scare the elusive beasts away. But I wasn't taking any chances. I had a full magazine of .308 Accubons at my command, should it come to that. And I was an expert shot, having been shooting since I was a kid. I was standing now in a firing stance and stepping towards the black smear while talking. It didn't move as it came into full view. I lowered my rifle. Animal kill. I let out a sigh of relief and walked over to it, chuckling out loud at my nervousness. It was the scene of a bird's demise, a turkey by the looks of it, and fresh. There had been a struggle, and there were feathers everywhere. A fox or a coyote had a good meal, that was for certain. One of its claws was left from the drumstick up. It had been knocked off. I saw the other leg propped up against the tree nearby, and under it was the tail fan. I went to check it out. It looks unnatural. The fan had been cleanly severed from the bird, and the leg had been cut off at the joint with a knife. The evil-looking claw had clearly been propped up against the tree by someone. I tossed the claw from between my fingertips, anxious to be rid of it. My mind began racing again. I was in the middle of nowhere with no trails. There are no witches. I mumbled as I stood up. I took a deep breath and pressed on uncertainly. It was nearly dusk now. The brackish small lake could come into view. The wind was gusting now, carrying with it the scent of putrid, semi-frozen water. I was still feeling rattled, but I resolved to find a spot, set up camp, build a big-ass fire, and drink the flask of brandy I had in my breast pocket, eat some food, and fall asleep. That would make everything better. I was nearing the edge of a clearing by the lake, feeling better about my situation when I heard a loud splash, sounding like something big jumped into the water, closely followed by another one. Then nothing but the wind, as ripples spread across the water. I moved closer to see where they or it had gone, and then I heard them again. Sleigh bells. I could feel the tendrils of panic tightening around my chest and temples like the first time I had been in combat. My vision narrowed. Fuck you, Hanson. I've had enough of your shit. You're not gonna scare me out of here. Hello, come out here. Right fucking now, I shouted into the gloom. Yet I could see nothing for the trees more bells. I'm not ashamed to admit that I fled. I shouted a curse and started back the way I came in. I grabbed at my compass hanging from a lanyard at my shoulder. My hands were shaking as I tried to make out the luminous dial. The needle spun around at random, totally useless. I held my wrist with my other hand and tried to study it. The bells continued. While breaking into a jog, I fumbled for my GPS and hit the backtrack button. It lit up trail to my truck. I could swear the bells were following me. I'm warning you, quit following me. I had my rifle up now, aimed back towards the lake, but the bells didn't stop. I couldn't see anything by this point. It was pitch black. I realized the futility of threatening with a rifle in the dark, turned around and continued stomping through the woods, far too quickly, occasionally tripping and cursing. The bells started to subside, and then they stopped. Please make it to the truck. Please make it to the truck. I was chanting as I crashed through the tangle of woods. Finally, regained enough composure to put a headlamp on so I wouldn't fall down as much. It took me seemingly forever to fight myself through the undergrowth, skinning my shins and knees and hands. I was chanting the whole way when I finally got to the truck. I was certain. Nothing had followed me as I fumbled with the keys. More bells. I don't remember the drive home. Weeks passed. I calmed down. I was thankful that I wasn't harmed or had gone missing, somewhat selfishly, but also for my family's sake. I had a resolve to never go hunting alone again. I was watching TV with my wife one night. She was flipping channels. Would be staying at home, making a big picnic in bed, click. Missing hunters have been found after the surge, click. Wait, I yelled her, go back, go back. What's your problem, Jesus? Click. A provincial police officer's talking head appeared on the screen. Edward Hanson, 86 of Lanark County, and his brother Robert, 83, also from Lanark, have been found deceased weeks after the search for them had been called off. The coroner has ruled this to be an accidental drowning. No, no, no. No, no. I was standing now, hands on my head. What's wrong, babe? Babe. After being found on the shore of remote Little Birch Lake, no foul play is suspected, and we are not treating this as an active homicide investigation at this time. Anyone with information about their disappearance is urged to come forward. It was about 10 years ago. I was 21-year-old naive goth girl who always had a fascination with the occult ever since I was very young. I lived in my first apartment in Connecticut with my now ex-boyfriend. My ex and I shared a love of great music, alcohol, and visiting beautiful cemeteries at 3 a.m. to be mischievous, adventurous, and naughty at times. One night in particular, we had made our own Ouija board using a glass as the plan chat. Needless to say, it was uneventful, so we put it back in the car and drove home. When we arrived, it had just turned 4 in the morning, and our neighborhood was absolutely silent. Pitch black. Everyone had their lights out. We walked into the back door, which had a window on it, and closed it, and began to walk up the stairs. Before we got to the top, we froze in horror what we heard. It sounded like a hand slamming on the door window and dragging its hand down the glass slowly. It repeated this 3 more times. Our hearts jumped to our throats, and we stood in silence, in complete fear for what seemed like forever. We whispered back and forth, shaking and completely confused. I screamed, "Go away, you're not allowed in." For the rest of the night, we heard nothing. I still don't know what happened that night. But that was the night I truly believed in spirits. I work as a curator for an art gallery in Japan. In Japan, even in the most modernized city of Tokyo, everyone believes in ghosts. Even the most secular Japanese would be afraid of staying alone in places like the office due to the existence of the ghost that peers at you from the dark spaces in between. These eyes can be anywhere: the narrow space in between bookshelves, a slightly open drawer, etc. My story started late one evening when I had to stay past closing time to complete an assignment given to me by my repulsive boss. He was a fat, balding, sexist man who had an unrealistic idea of his own importance, and he expected any assignments given to be completed on the day itself. As I said, I was alone in the gallery on that day when I heard a soft tapping sound, which seemed to come from behind a painting. I dismissed it as some internal dripping of water within the wall and went on completing my assignment. The dripping got louder and louder, and I became increasingly frightened. Still, the assignment had to be completed. To quiet the disc, quiet in my heart, I decided to play some music in the office. However, after about 30 minutes, I heard a strange voice coming from the direction of the painting. It was voiced in a monotonous pitch, and it sounded human, but with an unhuman quality. Mind you, the entire gallery space was dark, with the lights switched off. Only the office had lights on. I wanted to leave at this point, and I couldn't shake off cold fear I felt at the back of my neck. However, to leave the office, I had to switch on the security system, which was located at the back of the gallery space, near the painting, which incidentally was a portrait piece. The painting featured a woman in a dress from the Victorian period, clutching a fan to her chest. I was at a loss for what to do. So, nothing happened at this point to end my dilemma. As I stood looking towards the dark gallery space, almost drowning and stupefying fear, I thought I saw something glisten from the painting. It seemed white in color to me. I decided to pluck up my courage to investigate. I didn't take more than 20 steps until I realized what it was. The glistening white came from the rolling eyeballs of the lady in the portrait, who was trying to roll her eyes at me to direct her gaze on me. Her eyeballs were the only part of her body that could move. The rest of her, including her head was facing the opposite direction for me. For some reason, I knew that if her gaze fell on me, that would be the end of my existence on Earth. Job or not, this was too much for me, and I turned and ran out of the gallery. The next morning, bright and early, I went back to the gallery. Although I had run out without locking the doors, every painting was still in place, even the painting of the portrait. The only difference is the painting is now a blank. The Victorian lady had managed to extricate herself from the painting and fled in the night. Imagine sleeping in a long trailer filled with 50 dudes and 2 sergeants to watch over everybody before we even knew about the ghost at the base. They told us about a cadet from last class who studied voodoo. The story went like this. As many of the cadets were taking showers, they had on one cadet sitting on his clothing chest talking to himself. They paid him no mind, just getting ready to go to bed, and getting ready for the next day. The sergeant said they were outside talking about what pranks they were going to play on the cadets that night. As they talked about, 5 cadets came running outside and said something was wrong. They ran inside to see what was going on. That's when they saw the cadet in a stand-up locker, with his back against the wall. He was very dark-skinned, but his eyes were red, and he was speaking a different language. They called the local MP to come and assist with this cadet. They told all the cadets to leave the housing. Mind you, it's 50 beds and one long trailer, 25 on each side. So as they waited for the police to arrive, they heard screaming and voices. Finally, the MPs arrived. When they walked in, the cadet was bent backwards while facing the door looking at them. Eyes redder than a summer strawberry, they called more people to get back up, and once they arrived, they went in and grabbed it. I'm not sure what's going on, who else was in there. Finally, they got a hold of them. They put him in a van and told him everything would be okay. He insisted that he lay flat on the floor so they wouldn't get him. And while they drove off the base, he started to scream saying, "They're coming to get me. They're coming out of the woods. I can see them. I can see them." Nobody else said anything. It turns out that every night, while everyone else was asleep, he practiced voodoo just like his father and grandmother did, and apparently he contacted some spirits and let them into his world. Back to my story. One night, we had to move some bunks down because some of the cadets were leaving. I told the sergeants I wanted to be on a top bunk. I was the only one who slept on one. I felt like a king. So one night as I slept, I rolled over to look at the other end, to see that a sergeant was watching us that night. But inside, I saw white figures standing beside everybody's bed. I wasn't sure what was going on. I tried to rub my eyes because everything was blurry and I knew I had to be dreaming. I believed in ghosts, but I didn't know what to expect. I didn't want to make any movements that might draw their attention to me, so I just rolled over. Next to my bunk bed, which was against the wall, was the third sergeant's office, where they sat and watched everything. It was a small room that had huge windows, so they could just watch everything that was going on. As I looked, I saw somebody, but I only saw them from the chest down, and they had on hat. They were all in black, kind of like somebody wearing a trench coat. I rubbed my eyes one more time, not sure if I was dreaming or not. I tapped my bottom bunk to wake him up. But I didn't take my eyes off of this man trench coat. I thought that if I turned around, the white figures would be up close to my face because they knew I was awake, or even the man in the back would be closer to my face. So I didn't want to be loud, and I didn't want to move my eyes. My bunkmate wouldn't wake up, and Trenchcoat was moving closer and closer. I didn't know what to do. My body went numb. My skin started to get hot. I felt the cold energy in the room. I felt something grab my hand. It was cold, and I couldn't pull my hand out of their grip. I didn't know what to say or to do or to believe. I let out a scream, but nothing came out. My bunkmate was still snoring away, so I knew he didn't have the grip on my hand. I rolled over, and it was in my face. The white figure was in my face. I looked at it, and it was so bright I couldn't see. I just saw the shape of a young boy, and many of these other boys behind him. I heard him speak. My eyes were as wide as a bowling ball. He told me that they stood behind and beside our beds to protect us, and that they weren't going to harm anybody, that they were protecting us from him. I suddenly went to sleep, and I can't remember anything from that moment on. Every now and then I get a visit from the young boy that I named Gordon. He's my friend now. I lived in Long Beach, California for about 5 years. I lived in several places, but the first place I moved to with my boyfriend was near Wilson High School, if you know where that is. Anyway, we rented a bungalow that was behind the main house. If you're familiar with Long Beach, there are a lot of rentals like this. This was a 2-bedroom house. The second bedroom we used for an office, and we both felt that that room was the most active. Our cat would always go into that room and stare at the wall as if it could see something that we couldn't. One night I couldn't sleep, so I went out into the living room to watch a little TV. While I was sitting on the couch out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone walk from our bedroom into the office. When I went to check, there was no one there, and my boyfriend was fast asleep. We had friends that lived across the street from us, and their house had weird things happen, which makes me believe the street we lived on was haunted. I would like to start by saying that this experience did not happen to me, but to my grandfather. I was always close to my grandfather. We stayed close up until his death. One thing that I admired most about my grandfather was his tough-as-nails attitude. He always carried himself with such confidence. I had never seen him afraid of anything, and I never seen him lose that fearlessness, except for when he would talk about something that happened to him when he was a teenager. I heard him tell this story only a couple of times in my life. But when he would lose that fearless attitude I mentioned before. His voice would become shaky and quiet, and he would get this frightful look in his eye. The experience happened to him in the mid-1940s when he was around 14 or 15 years old. He grew up in a rural mountain town in Kentucky. One evening, he was taking the dirt road back to his house after visiting his older sister that lived a short distance from their family. It was beginning to get dark, so he hurried along, fearing his parents would begin to worry. To get home, he had to cross an old rickety wooden bridge that sat over a creek. Then, after the bridge, there was a split in the dirt path. Left would take him home. Right, LED, God knows where. He began crossing the bridge. By this time, it was getting quite dark. Halfway across the bridge, he noticed what seemed to be a woman wearing a white nightgown that a woman back then would wear to bed. She also had long, black hair that was well past her waist. My grandfather said this was especially strange since during that time, women didn't leave the house as much like they do now, especially in the rural area he grew up in, and especially not in the evening as the sun was going down, and the fact that she was wearing bedclothes made it all the more strange. She was coming down the trail to the right. So my grandfather turned left and began to walk towards his home. She then turned onto the bridge and got halfway across it and stopped. It was then that the thought crossed my grandfather's mind that something may have been wrong. So living in the small rural area, he figured he probably knew whoever this was. So he began to call out the names of all the women that lived near him. He also called out the names of his mother and sisters. The woman then turned toward him and began coming his way. He then noticed something that disturbed him. He said it looked like she was not taking steps. It's hard to explain, but he described it as her moving towards him. But her legs not taking any steps, they stayed perfectly still as she moved across the ground toward him. He was paralyzed with shock and fear. She then got within about 8 feet from him, and he noticed something that terrified him even more. She got close enough to him, that with the short distance between them and the light from the moon, he noticed she did not have any facial features. It was like her face was just a smooth, flesh-colored surface. She had no eyes, no nose, no mouth. She had no facial features whatsoever. He said by then he was terrified, and he turned around and ran home as fast as he could. He said he didn't remember much of the sprint home. He only remembered being home, sitting on the floor of the kitchen, completely inconsolable. He said he remembers crying and shaking and feeling nauseous as his mother stood over him trying to figure out why he was in the state he was in. After a little time, when he had calmed down, he told the events to his family. His father and his siblings didn't pay him any mind, but his mother believed every word he said, partly because she was superstitious, but also because she was the only one to see how inconsolable he was when he arrived home. Time passed, and he never had seen again, whatever the thing was, but he said that he will never forget what he saw, and that it still terrifies him to think about whatever it was on that mountain in the middle of the night.